You've probably noticed how culture loves to argue about boomers, decode millennials, and narrate every new mood of Gen Z. But there's a strange blank space in the middle, a whole generation that seems to exist everywhere, in offices, in families, and institutions, yet is barely discussed. And here's the part that should bother you a little. The less you talk about a group, the easier it is to misunderstand them. So why does Generation X feel like background noise in a world addicted to spotlight? And why do so many of them seem calm in crises, skeptical of promises, and oddly allergic to needing anything from anyone? Stay with me, because near the end we'll land on the one role Gen X has been playing for decades, the role that explains why they don't ask to be seen, even when they're holding everything together. You weren't imagining it. Gen X is the middle child. Generation X is usually defined as those born roughly between 1965 and 1980. That matters because the generations on either side of them became cultural landmarks. Boomers are tied to huge demographic and political shifts. Millennials became the main character generation of the internet era. Gen Z became the symbol of the algorithm age. Gen X, by contrast, often gets reduced to aesthetic nostalgia, mixtapes, MTV, grunge, or dismissed with one word, cynical. But cynicism is usually what people call it when they don't understand the function of someone's emotional style. For Gen X, that style wasn't random, it was trained. Childhood without safety nets creates a specific kind of brain. A lot of Gen X grew up with what the culture later called the latchkey childhood, coming home to empty houses, handling afternoons alone, learning early that no one was coming to rescue you from small problems. The term latchkey kid became common in the 1970s and 1980s and is strongly associated with Gen X. Even if your childhood wasn't dramatic, a quiet absence can still shape you. Because in developmental psychology, consistency isn't a luxury, it's infrastructure. When early life doesn't reliably provide a responsive adult presence, you adapt. Not always consciously, but efficiently. You learn to anticipate consequences. You learn to self-soothe. You learn to think two steps ahead because mistakes are expensive. And over time, one lesson sinks in deeper than the rest. Attention is not guaranteed. When trust breaks early, hope starts to feel like a risk. Then adulthood arrives, and instead of stable systems, many Gen Xers watched institutions wobble. Families splitting, companies restructuring, promises changing mid-sentence. Even the data around family stability marks their era. In the US, the refined divorce rate peaked around 1980, often cited as 22.6 divorces per 1,000 married women, and has generally declined since. If you're shaped inside an era where forever looks temporary, you start building a different psychological strategy. Not optimism, not doom. Something colder and safer, prepared realism. You assume systems can fail. You assume plans can collapse. And you quietly design your life so you won't be destroyed when they do. The Gen X emotional style, restraint, distance, and the shield of irony. To people who didn't grow up that way, Gen X can look detached, or sarcastic, or private to the point of invisibility. But emotional distance is often a skill, not a flaw, especially for someone who learned early that being too open makes you vulnerable. There's a reason Gen X humor so often carries that dry, deadpan edge. Irony can say, I see the risk without admitting, I feel it. Because if you grew up believing that exposure leads to pain, then being publicly sentimental doesn't feel brave. It feels careless. And that's where the privacy instinct comes from. Not because they don't care, but because caring openly once felt unsafe. Work and authority. Competence over charisma. Gen X is often described as resourceful and independent, shaped by having to figure things out. Source that shows up most clearly in how many of them relate to work and authority. They don't automatically respect titles, they respect capability. If you want a Gen Xer's loyalty, you don't win it with slogans or culture posters. You win it by being useful when things break. And because they were trained in consequence-heavy environments, many Gen Xers have low tolerance for incompetence, especially when it's dressed up as confidence. They're not anti-leadership, they're anti-performative leadership. The pre-internet mind. Deep learning, slow problem solving, lasting skills. There's another feature that's easy to miss if you didn't live it. Gen X learned in an era where information didn't fall into your lap. If you wanted an answer, you had to look for it. Ask someone, read something physical, test something, break something, fix something. That kind of learning builds a different relationship with knowledge. Less instant, more embodied. It's not just nostalgia, it's cognitive conditioning. When learning costs effort, the brain tends to encode it differently, more sticky, more durable. So when people call Gen X quietly competent, they're often pointing at a real developmental advantage. They practice thinking without constant external scaffolding. The modern tension, watching the next generation live exposed. Now imagine what it feels like to be Gen X and watch younger generations grow up in the opposite environment. Constant supervision, constant connection, constant visibility. To Gen X, visibility can feel like danger, because in their internal wiring, being seen meant being judged, targeted, or let down. So when they see kids broadcasting their lives depending on systems, trusting platforms, and sharing emotions in public, it can trigger a quiet alarm. Why would you make yourself that easy to reach? Not because Gen X is cold, because Gen X is trained to equate distance with safety. Gen X as the bridge generation. Here's the reframe that changes everything. Gen X isn't missing. They're structurally positioned as the bridge between worlds. Analog childhood, digital adulthood, old institutions, new instability, privacy culture, exposure culture. And bridges don't get celebrated, they get used. They don't trend. They don't announce themselves. They don't ask for applause. They just hold weight. If you've ever met someone who stays calm while everyone else panics, someone who doesn't romanticize institutions but still shows up anyway, someone who doesn't need to be seen to be real, you've seen the Gen X adaptation in its final form. Not apathy, not bitterness, a kind of resilience that forms when you grow up learning one quiet truth. No one is coming, so you become someone who can handle it. Reflective ending. Questions, not conclusions. So here's what I want you to sit with. When you look at Gen X, do you see a generation that doesn't care? Or a generation that learned to care in private because it was safer there? And if you relate to that, even a little, what part of you is still living by an old rule? Silence equals safety? Because maybe the real story of Gen X isn't that they disappeared. Maybe it's that they became the kind of people who can survive without being witnessed. And that's both their strength and their wound.